Onto the wheels. It's been quite difficult to find 15mm plywood. Around here all you can get is 12mm or 19. But one of my timber merchants had just done a stock take and said, oh, there's one old piece, it's a bit dirty, but I can do you a decent price. So I have some 15mm plywood. I've cut it up into 4 40cm squares, or just slightly over 40 centimeters, and I'm going to cut it on a pivot against the router in the table, and I've just been making myself a slide for the platform here to hold it in the track using my Rip Fence micro adjustment gauge. See the video, link below. I'm just going through these plywood boards that the wheels will be cut from, matching the warps. So a cup against a bow, so that when they're glued up they'll compensate for each other, hopefully. You can use MDF, according to Matthias, in his third 14-inch bandsaw build, but although I have a fairly good mask, the room doesn't have any extraction, and I don't fancy cutting up and turning a lot of MDF. I'm going to mark up the centres of the boards, and at the centre I'll put a pivot hole. My pivot pin is about 4mm, and I'm going to use the same diameter pivot pin on the router table sled and on my disc sander sled. And I'm also going to reference everything off that centre. It's much more difficult to reference things off a great big hole in the middle, so the great big hole in the middle is to come later. With my centre point here, still a point, I've taken the opportunity to put in all the markings I can think of. Out here are going to be the holes that are used for putting the clamps through when you put the flanges on here, glue the flanges on. This is to be a guide for the flange. I want to minimise the amount of truing and balancing, so the closer I can get the flange to being central, the better. And I'm also, I think, going to make my flange circular, not the sort of circle corner square that's in the plans. Now the other thing that strikes me is these holes are quite small, they're 4 centimeters. I've checked them on the plan and made a cut, and my clamps won't go through. Oh, hang on. Ah, there we go. That's the bit that won't go through. The only ones that'll go through are these cheap small ones from the local shed. So I might be able to get away with those, or I might make these slightly bigger. But whatever, you want to check your hole size there against your clamps to make sure you can get your clamps through there. Well, I messed this up a little bit. I've carefully measured the radius of the wheel from the edge of the cutter to the pivot point, but I didn't tighten up the router lift. And given the modified router lift that I have, when you tighten this up, it goes in this direction and the cutter moves a little bit. Still, it's not a problem. This is a sliding sled, so I'll just send it that way a bit and I'll drill another hole. I drilled the first pivot hole freehand, and despite my best efforts it wasn't quite exactly perpendicular, and that threw the circle out very slightly. So this time I'm using a vertical drill jig like that. If I can just get the chuck through, there we go. I'm starting off with these C-clamps because they move the wood less as they tighten. The quick clamps and the G-clamps, they make the wood surfaces slither over the glue. They never tighten absolutely vertically. My meanness has resulted in a tiny little problem. These wheels are 16 inches, it's a 16-inch bandsaw, except they're not quite 16 inches. The plans call for 40 centimetres, and that means you can get 4 out of them across a 4-foot board. But only just. By the time you've taken 2 kerfs out of a 4-foot wide board, you're left with pretty much exactly 40 centimetres. You've only got about a couple of millimetres in excess of that. So if this isn't true, and if I have to turn it and true it, I might be taking off more material than I've allowed for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a hole in the centre of the wheel, the diameter of my shaft, and like Matthias's 14-inch bandsaw, this is plumbing pipe rather than shafting. And this plumbing pipe is pretty close to 22 millimeters, which is the internal diameter of the bearing. So if I put a 22 millimeter hole in the center here with my Forstner bit, oh, here comes the rain, I can mount the wheel and the flanges on a shaft as I glue the flanges to the wheel, and hopefully that'll leave me with the minimum of truing. I'll just need a moderate shim there, and I'll need a tiny shim there. It does mean that I will have to reach through the internal diameter of the bearing eventually and take away a little bit of the circumference of this hole that'll be going through there, because you don't eventually want this wheel rubbing on the shaft. You only want the wheel running on its bearings, but I don't think that'll be too difficult. Well, we shall see. I'm just trying out a couple of experiments here in some old scrap pine. Of course, the real thing will be Baltic birch, because it needs to be super strong, and it's for the wheel flanges. Now, the outside diameter of my bearings is 50 millimeters. I do have a 50 millimeter Forstner bit, but it drills a 50.1 hole, and that's just a little bit slack. We want a very tight friction fit. So then I set up the fly cutter, or at least that's what I call it, hole cutter. And I've reasonably successfully created a hole that's just the other side of 50 millimeters in diameter, into which I wonder if I actually have to try, I can press fit my bearing. The problem with a fly cutter or hole cutter, that thing that spins around with a couple of knives on it, is it's rough, and when you get through to the other side, oh, that was another experiment, that's not what it looks like when you get through to the other side. There's quite a lot of tear out, but you don't need to get through to the other side. Once you've got a decent rim here, you can do the rest of the work. If you have another hole in the middle here, you can do the rest of the work with a bearing guided cutter, and that will be nice and neat. I've got my flange blank marked up. It's in Baltic birch. I've decided to make the diameter 13 centimeters instead of the 12 centimeters of the plans, because in the plans it's a square with its corners rounded off, and for, as I've said, ease of truing it and ease of balancing it, I'm going to make it a circle. And as usual, when you're doing this kind of thing, you need to plan the order of the holes in the middle quite carefully. So at the moment I've got my measuring point here, and the first thing I'm going to drill is a 4 millimeter hole for the pivot, which you can just see at the top of the picture there, as I turn the outside into a circle. And then the second hole I'll make is the pilot drill of the fly cutter for the rough start to the bearing hole in the middle, and then it'll get even bigger still, so I can put the bearing guided cutter through and finish off the 49.5mm diameter bearing hole. Now I've got to get rid of this centre portion here so that the bearing guided router cutter can actually reach the rim. It wobbles about a bit, but it does work. Then a little bit of tidying with the chisel to get the last little wall here blocking access to the rim. God, is this working? Bloody hell, that's good. I tried gluing on the flanges and truing up horizontally the first time, and it didn't work so well. The natural tendency as you glue of the glue to slither, and as you clamp for it to slither even more, is exacerbated by trying to do it all horizontally. So I've got myself a piece of axle shaft. It's this iron plumbing pipe clamped up here, and I've got one of the bearings loose there, flanges, sorry, and I've knocked that about a little bit until that's nice and perpendicular, or it was. Anyway, I should get that as perpendicular as I can. There's a bit of an illusion going on here. It sometimes seems as though this is a cone. You put your right angle there and it's leaning to the left, and you put your right angle there and it's leaning to the right. Anyway, I'll sort that out off camera. And I will put the wheel on there. I shall still bore a 22mm hole in the wheel and use some shims, and then I will glue the other flange on, and I will use weights until the glue is grabbed, and then I will clamp it. And finally, when it's all done, I'll reach inside with my Dremel and remount the hole in the wheel so that it's a bit bigger than 22 and doesn't bind on the shaft. This is the closest thing I could find to a circular, or should I say annular, weight to try to get that glue to grab before I then put the clamps on. And it's pretty free. Perhaps I should have put less glue on. Well, there's goodly squeeze out. Perhaps I should stop moving it now. Oh, yes, there we go. That's grabbed. With the bottom flange glued on, I've put the top flange on and I've pressed it down, so hopefully they are sandwiching the wheel as they will when they're glued, and I'm checking for true, and it's not too bad. There's some eccentricity because the Forstner bit did slip a millimetre whilst drilling the centre hole. Grr. But it is running nice and true, certainly running truer than the previous effort that I tried to set and balance up horizontally. So I think this vertical setup is working a little bit better. Now I just need to make sure that the hole in the middle of the main wheel segment here is clear of the shaft, which I think it is. I've already done a bit of work with a Dremel, and I've measured this distance here so that it just gets past the inner race of the bearing and bears on the wood. I don't trust my wobbly hands to actually pass it through their spinning, so I'm going to start it up in there and just take a bit more off. Okay, well, the vertical method of assembly, clamping and gluing, wins. That is quite a bit truer than the horizontally mounted, glued and clamped one turned out. Although I will have to find a way of preventing the shim from moving, but some thread lock, some Loctite 243 should sort that out.